My name is Maureen Kinyanjui. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. And my research is co-supervised by the University of Edinburgh and University of Kent. I've titled my talk today as The Human Dimensions of Human-Elephant Conflict. I started off my career as a social scientist in the field of rural development, food security, and drought management. And then after 8 years in this field, I remember one night I watched TV, it was in the news, and I saw elephants. There's an elephant that was killed because of crop raiding. And that motivated me to go into conservation. And that's why I am at the moment working in the field of human-elephant coexistence. In my research, I'm using political ecology and systems theory to help me understand what is contributing to human-elephant conflict and how can we make the coexistence more sustainable. As I start this talk, I would like to share one piece of advice that I learned, and that is that all knowledge is partial and linked to the context in which it is created. So the reason for sharing my background is that you can better understand what has influenced me to develop and to understand this conflict from this perspective that I'm going to share with you, and what has motivated me to come to the conclusions that I will share with you. And I think going forward as students, it's also important to always look at the positionality or what has influenced the person or the paper, maybe the research you're looking at, what has influenced that person to come to that conclusion. And when we look at, and when you understand that all knowledge is partial, it also gives us an opportunity to learn from different people and to learn from different perspectives so that we can get a holistic understanding of the conflict and have a more holistic solutions to managing the conflict, as will be shared by Susan in the next talk. When you look at human-elephant conflict in Kenya, we see that it is becoming the incidence of conflicts in Kenya are increasing. And this is because the human population is increasing and they're expanding their land so that they can have land to grow their food. As well as elephant population is also increasing, especially in Kenya, because of the good conservation activities that have been done over the years. So as human population increasing, we are finding that elephants, as the number increased, they still go back to where they were, where the ancient corridors, and when they go there, they find that there are human settlements that are there. So the interaction between humans and elephants over time is increasing. And then what is complicating the matter is that we have other elements like climate change, which is making both the humans and the wildlife to fight for survival and to fight for shared resources, which is increasing the conflict. Also in Africa, the research has shown that about 80% of elephants are living outside protected areas, which means that they are found in private ranches and in community lands, which contributes to the increasing conflict. And this poses a very urgent call for conservationists to be able to find and understand what is causing the conflict and how we can manage the conflict so that we can promote coexistence. When we look at conflict, I think if I ask you what you think about human-elephant conflict, you'll find an image like this is what has always been in the media, and it's what has framed your understanding of the conflict. And to be honest, this is what also framed my understanding of the conflict and motivated me to go into conservation. But then in this narrative and in this understanding, we see that it's always the humans and the wildlife that seem to be always in conflict. And we have news reports like what we see here. There's a lot of blame game going around. And this is because understanding human-elephant conflict is very complex. And there's so many layers to it that it's hard to pinpoint what is directly contributing to the conflict and to have a solution that can be taken in by both parties. There's a researcher from South Africa, Richard Ore, who says that developing effective human-wildlife conflict mitigations, and particularly interventions addressing conflicts with elephants, is an art. It's not even a science. It's much of an art than a science, because you have to bring together different perspectives and different components of the conflict so that you can be able to manage the conflict well. So in this blame game where there's a lot of people pointing fingers at each other, that's where my research is trying to come in to find out what to create, to tease apart what is going on and to find solutions and to managing the problem, and also to making coexistence a more sustainable state for both, that will benefit both wildlife and humans. My research and what the framework that I will use to explain this talk is based in Sagala ward in Voi County, Voi sub-county in Kenya. And I like using case studies because case studies highlight that when you're talking about coexistence, it is very context specific. It depends and it relies on what is happening at the very site. So it is very hard for us as Kenyans, for example, to adopt human wildlife conflict mitigation measures as they are from maybe South Africa and then copy paste them and put them in Kenya. Because whatever is happening in Sagala or what has happened over time in Sagala is very different from what has happened over time, probably in Laikipia. And that is why it is important to look at the context and to understand the history of the area, the patterns of relationship between the stakeholders in that area, and the social ecological factors and changes that are contributing to conflict specifically in that area. And I will use the example of Sagala to highlight this, that in Sagala, we have the Sagala community is located between Tsavo East and Tsavo West National Park. And this was before a colonial settlement. And the colonialists during that time, they forcefully evicted people from their ancestral homes that were now for Tsavo East and Tsavo West and relocated them to the foot of Sagala Hill. And the community is now stationed 5 kilometers from the foot of the hill. And away from that, we have ranches and private ranches that are used for wildlife ranches and also for sisal farms. So when you look at the history of Sagala and in Taita Taveta as a whole, you find that 60% of the county is designated for protected areas, and the community only resides on 12%. Which is, for me, as I started my research, was very shocking because I was the conservationist who was going to the community members to tell them that they've encroached on wildlife territory. But then understanding this history has made me more sensitive to designing conservation approaches, because when I tell the community members they're encroaching, and then you understand the history that they're only living on 13% of their county, and all of it was once initially the ancestral home, it makes you it makes you more conscious of the history and how the decision making that has been done in the past is contributing to the conflict that you're seeing at the present. And to unpack the complexity of conflict, we need to look at it through a lens. So like when you take the image of human-elephant conflict that you've had before in your head, and when you see that it's usually the humans and the wildlife that are in conflict, this is the event. But when you zoom out, you start seeing the different layers that are contributing to the conflict. And for example, when you look at this picture, the community has herded this elephant into a river after the elephant ate their crops. But when we zoom out, we get to understand that even the event of the crop raiding is not what has precipitated the conflict, but there are underlying deep-rooted social issues that have not been addressed. So for example, this is something that I developed while working with the community members, and I lived in Sagala for 2 years, but then when I started my PhD research, it's like I was a completely new person in the community, because I started to understand the different layers and the perception that the community has of the problem and the conflict is very different from what I envisioned or perceived as a conservationist. So the community took me through what the different links and the different links and the connections that they see in the community that are contributing to the conflict. And they talked about how when there's no rainfall, it contributes to low vegetation cover crops, and when this contributes to low vegetation for elephants in the protected areas, which leads them to go to the ranches or or come to the community to look for food and water. At the same time, when there's no rainfall, we have poor agricultural yields, which leads to food insecurity. And because there's no jobs in agriculture, a lot of people are becoming unemployed. And you'll find in this community, a lot of young men and older men are getting into social ills like alcoholism, which increases the burden on the women. And because they need to get food, they need to look for water, they start cutting down trees. So it's a vicious cycle that is happening on the social level, but all of this is contributing to the conflicts with elephants. And when we look at it as well, we see that there is also outside the conservation organizations who have the same, when putting myself in these shoes, I had a different perception of the conflict than what the community thinks is the conflict. And when I tell the community to do, during the projects, when you tell the communities to not do this, to not do that, we are contradicting to what they believe is going on. And this also creates conflict, among other things like the history of land dispossession and the policies that are being put by the government that seem not to be congruent with what the community believes is happening. And apart from what is happening internally, we also have external factors contributing to conflict, like climate change, because when you look at the research has said that Africa is contributing to 4% of the carbon emissions, but then 87% is from the northern, like the countries in the global north. But yet the focus has always been on the local community members. What are they doing? How should they change their behavior so that they can stop climate change? But then what my research has shown me is that we also need to look up and not just always focus on the local community on the ground, but also look up and look at the system and what is happening in the system that is contributing to the conflict that is happening on the ground, like in Sagala. And as my friend Jonas, who is in the community member, told me, we are not totally responsible for the weather changing, but we bear the costs they bear the cost of elephants in the community. And when I did my research in March, I found that Jonas was he showed me his tree house where he spends most of his nights when the elephants are crop raiding and when they're about to harvest. And also this highlighted to me the different dimensions, like the conflict and how it actually affects the social life and the well-being of the community members. And if the community members continue with this kind of what they call them in research, we call them intangible costs of living with wildlife, it also contributes to the conflict and also hampers the goal of achieving coexistence. So I've highlighted first how the social ecological changes are contributing to the conflict. And when we're looking at coexistence, we don't only look at the ecological part and that, for example, how the elephants' migration patterns are being disrupted, but we're also looking at the social part and what is happening between the community members in their lives and how that affects their relationship between the elephants and human being and themselves. But then also I have highlighted that the conflict is usually not between the humans and the wildlife. It's actually between the humans and the humans themselves and other humans who are, for example, the conservationists who have different values concerning the same land. So if we have farmers, they have different values from conservationists who want to protect the land to conserve wildlife. And it's this clash of values that is contributing to what we have, human-elephant conflict. And the second thing I want to highlight is the emotions. And the Dr. Ian Douglas Hamilton, one of the leading elephant ecologists in Africa, has said that the conservation of elephants will largely depend on how people feel and think about elephants. And when we're looking, and that's the second thing my research is looking at, is the emotions. Apart from the social ecological changes, I've realized that when these changes are happening, there's a lot of emotions that are carried by the people, or these changes brings about different emotions in the community members. And when we understand emotions, we can be able to understand how the conflict is being expressed by the community members. So I'll give you an example of a story that I found while doing my research early this year in Sagala. And in this photo, we have land. We can clearly tell that because of the increasing periods of drought in the community, a lot of farmers, a lot of people have now even stopped trying to farm. And in this case, there was this young man who had recently built his house, and he's just finished high school and he's gotten a job as a herder. And then he has built his house, and because the crops failed and he was not able to get any income from agriculture, that's why he became a herder. And during that night, there's one night that when I was there, luckily he was not in the house, but an elephant came and broke into the house. And you can see how, and I was quite shocked because the elephant was standing about here, but it was able to reach its trunk and open the house roof from there. And when I met this young man after the incident, I realized he was very distraught, but also very happy that he was not in the house at that time, because things could go either way. But then he could have been injured or killed by the elephant, because the elephant was also starving, and that's why it broke into the house, because he had a bucket of maize that he'd bought with his wages that he'd earned in 1 month. And from this story, it contributes to understanding emotions, because if this is happening, if this is happening all the time, we see that the community members will retaliate towards the wildlife. And usually when you look at human-elephant conflict, most of the solutions have always been technical. We build fences to protect the crops, because as what we understood was that if we stop the elephants from crop raiding, then will somehow reduce the conflict. But then because of the social ecological changes, for example, and climate change, we see that it brings another dimension of the conflict, which we did not understand. So if there's no crops in the farm, then conflict still prevails. And also in this community as well, we had in the last year between January and February, still there was no crops in the farms. There was no houses being destroyed, but the community killed 3 elephants. And I remember I was asking the Kenya Wildlife Service people what they think contributed to it, and they could not understand, because there was no visible event or that was reported that could have caused the elephants to be killed. But then what I understand now through my research is that even if there's no event that triggers this, the emotions that are carried by the community members over time keep on piling up. And even if a drought like this and a misunderstanding by the community members that the needs of the elephants are being prioritized over their own needs, is a triggering effect, is a triggering thing that makes the community members retaliate. And I will share this slide as well with you. And it's this part of the slide is the same thing that I'd shown you in a previous slide. But when you look at the emotions that from all these changes and for the elephants coming to the community area, we see that it increases frustration and feelings of helplessness in the community, because they're feeling vulnerable because of the drought. They're not able to have their food. They're not able to have food, and they're not able to get jobs. And also when the elephants are coming in, they're also depleting the little resources that they have that will help them manage the drought. And when this happens, the anger is not given, like the community they're not angry with the elephants themselves. The community members are angry towards the local conservationists, as they are perceived to prioritize elephant conservation over human needs. And that's why most of the time when when you see the qualitative research on human-elephant conflict, I think in all the communities, they always say that they believe that conservationists value elephants more than their lives. And they'll always give you the example, as I've gotten in Masai Mara, in Amboseli in Kenya and in Sagala, that when an elephant dies, you'll see choppers coming from Nairobi immediately, and like land cruisers from all the conservation organizations going to investigate. But when an elephant kills a human being, then the police will, in the morning, then the police will come in the evening, and no one will be seen around there. So these are also emotions and the perceptions of the community members that are contributing to the conflict. But because the community members feel powerless and they're not able to, they feel that they cannot contribute to the discussion or have a channel for their frustration, it increases, this increased tension is directed towards the elephants, because as one community member told me that because of the drought, they said, if we spear an elephant, then we'll get the government to realize that we have a drought and that will give us food. So apart from highlighting that the conflict is not even between people and elephant, between humans and wildlife, it's between two different groups of people. It also highlights the importance of understanding the emotions and listening to what the community members are going through. I will come to this slide. So what in my research has found out is that for coexistence to be sustainable, local communities need to be decision makers in conservation efforts and not just beneficiaries. Because like this power, the feeling of powerlessness comes when they're not able to contribute to the decisions that are being made about their lives. You'll find that when you're looking at the policies that are being made around human wildlife coexistence, sometimes they're being made so remotely they're made remotely, maybe even in London or in Nairobi, but the lived experiences of the community members are not understood. And that's why, to make coexistence more sustainable, we don't need to look at community members just as beneficiaries, but we also need to empower them and bring them in the decision table so that they can contribute their knowledge and understanding about what is happening. As I began by saying that all knowledge is partial. So even the scientific knowledge that we have is also partial. And for us to get a complete picture of what is happening, we need to have the knowledge from the community members as well to inform the conservation, approaches that we have. And the second thing is that people's and elephant needs should be integrated and trade-offs negotiated, because as the community members believe that their needs are second to elephant needs, we need to also meet the needs of the community members. And this has made me, when I started conservation, I thought I'll be working with elephants and trying to protect elephants. But what I found out, majority of the time I'm working with the community members, and I'm still helping them improve their food security. I'm helping them manage drought, because I've realized that you cannot talk to the community member and tell them to take care of their wildlife or to love elephants or protect elephants when they're not able to have food on their table, or when they're not able to take their children to school. So we need to integrate the needs of the community members and wildlife, and also negotiate trade-offs. We cannot get 100% of what we want as conservationists, or the farmers cannot get 100% of what they want, but we can meet in between so that coexistence can happen. And then we also need to decrease the cost and increase the benefits of living with elephants. We also need to include climate change adaptation into conflict management. As I've said, the climate change has just came and just it just came, and like the effects of climate change have really brought a new understanding of what is happening. So it's not very direct about like the way we had understood human-elephant conflict, because climate change has just made muddied the waters and an understanding about what is happening. So when we're thinking about social ecological changes, we also need to think about how we can increase the adaptation of the community members and also increase sustainable resilience in the system so that we can be able to manage coexistence. And then we also need to have systemic transformation. to foster just coexistence efforts and reduce power inequalities. As I've said, we need to stop just looking at the community members and thinking how can we increase their tolerance? How can we make them change so that we can achieve conservation goals? But also need to look at ourselves and to look at the system and see what is actually increasing the vulnerability of the community members and causing them to have more, and causing human wildlife conflict to be more prevalent. So in summary, I want to say that it's to better manage conflict between humans and wildlife, underlying social factors contributing to the conflict need to be explored. And secondly, it is crucial to include interdisciplinary approaches and local knowledge in human wildlife conflict management. And then analyzing how emotions help navigate social ecological changes can contribute to understanding how to achieve sustainable coexistence. And when you're looking at emotions, there's this paper by one of my supervisors, Sam Stadon, and she's talking about listening as a new method, a research methodology that we need to approach, because the community members have been saying the same thing over and over again, but then we also need to listen to what they're saying. And also this requires us to embrace the spirit of respect, and also to open up opportunities so that we can include perceptions and understanding of people's lived experiences. And to conclude, I want to give an example of what some of my friends in Sagala are doing to help promote coexistence. I have my friend called Esther Serem, who is working with the Mlambeni basket weavers. And because, as I've shown you, that the community, there's increased responsibility in the household, and the women are the ones whose responsibilities are increasing, to stop them from cutting down trees and to stop them from feeling powerless. And this is one of the projects that I started, and Esther is now the one leading the project. We are trying to promote different eco enterprises so that women can stop depending on agriculture, which is unreliable because of drought, and also find alternative income sources so that they're able to support their family. And we've seen that they're more receptive to start talking about elephant conservation when they're able to feed their children and not keep on stressing about getting food and finding water, because they are now having extra income in their pocket. Another person I want to give a shout out to and to highlight his work is Victor Ndombi. He's a friend of mine who is also working in Sagala, and he's improving community livelihoods and also improving food security of the community members by teaching them about agroecology and how to grow crops that are not preferred by elephants, like sunflowers and chili, and also how to have sustainable agricultural methods. And he's also training the young children in Kilewa Primary School and teaching them and trying to train them to be early conservationists. And I think this is one of the moves that we need to do in conservation, is that we need to integrate local youth and young children into conservation from an early age, because they better understand where the environment that they've grown up in, and they're able to contribute to understanding and managing human-elephant conflict. And so these are my references. And thank you for listening to me. These are my contacts if you want to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join this session, this amazing series of talks on human wildlife conflict and how to promote coexistence. My name is Suzanne Maingi, and I'm passionate about conservation, wildlife conservation, and sustainability. Currently, I am the conservation manager at Colobus Conservation, where we work in collaboration with the community to conserve, protect, and preserve up to 6 primate species and their coastal habitat in which they reside here in the south coast of Kenya. However, for the purpose of this talk, I would like to delve a bit deeper into my research and on conflict, and I won't really talk about colobus conservation for today. I also thought it would be important to give you a look into my early career field experience, because I know many like you, or many of you today are like me. I was in the same position in a Kenyan university, eager to go out into the field and do my part to protect wildlife and conserve our ecosystems. And right from the start, my first exposure into field conservation was through my industrial attachments, or the internships, as they're called, where I spent some time with the Institute of Primate Research along different departments, but my favorite particularly was the conservation and animal welfare departments, and through which I got exposure into primatology concepts. And I participated in a primatology field school where we traveled across the country. And this was my first glimpse into the different challenges experienced by communities on the ground. Soon after I graduated from Catholic University with a bachelor degree in biology, I joined Save the Elephants as one of the early interns for the Elephants and Bees project. This is the same project that Maureen, the presenter just before me, had the pleasure of highlighting the different amazing research that they do. And working with, and this was the first, my first experience working with communities in terms of finding solutions to promote conservation and to reduce the number of negative interactions. These pictures are from around 10 years ago. And around that time is also when we saw high levels of poaching, and like Maureen, it was constantly in the news. We always would see every day cases of poaching of elephants and all sorts of wildlife rampant from different areas of the country. And I sought it to join the forces on the ground to advocate for or against poaching. And I joined Wildlife Direct as one of the main campaign leaders for the Hands of Our Elephants campaign. And this also, again, took me around the country, engaging, and where I got to engage with communities to talk about conservation, their role in conservation. And like I mentioned, the more you get out into the field, the more you learn about the different experiences, the different perceptions that they had. And when I was out there asking communities not to poach wildlife, one of the common responses was that, sis, or you're my daughter, you know, they address you like they have known you forever. They're like, what can we do if these animals keep coming to raid our crops? My livestock are being killed every single day by the same wildlife you're asking me not to poach. We're not getting any help. We have to help ourselves. So in this spirit of community engagement in conservation, it really dawned to me that to bring communities back into the folds, to love wildlife again and to conserve the ecosystems in which they thrive, we have to meet them at their points of need. And some of the major points of need, and like Maureen said, conflict is one of the major issues after poaching that that impacts or could lead to or affects the survival of species in Africa. So this is around this time is when I thought, okay, maybe I can actually dedicate my career to conservation and do my part to see how I can work with communities to reduce the kind of challenges that they're experiencing, and to see how we can ensure the persistence of sustainable, green, and amazing ecosystems that are thriving with wildlife. You know, we all talk about how we don't want. We all talk about how Africa used to be teeming with wildlife, with scores of wildebeest and giraffe roaming around, and this case is not so much. But we all can do something to play our part to ensure that we can conserve wildlife for populations to come. So I left Wildlife Direct to pursue a master's degree at Michigan State University, where I studied fisheries and wildlife. I'm also a proud Mastercard Foundation alumni scholar. And while I was doing my master's, I thought to my main question was that what is the main species that is cited for negative interactions, conflict in Kenya or in Africa? And to unpack this, we have to define what negative interactions are. And as you can see, an example is livestock depredation. And this is a glimpse of the species that you can get compensation for in Kenya, according to the Wildlife Management Act of 2013. Another example of a negative interaction is crop destruction, where you have ungulates raiding farms. And similarly, these are the species you'll get compensation for in Kenya. Property damage. And you might notice that several species tend to pop up as I go around the wheel. And lastly, but not least, is the loss of human lives and human injury. And unfortunately, these are the only species that you can get compensation for, though we know there's a whole list of species that, that cause negative interactions, but are not factored into according to the Kenyan law. For example, primates are not on the list. So any issues with baboons, sykes and vervets might not accrue compensation where needed. At this point, I'd also like to mention that there have been challenges with the compensation schemes in Kenya, and there was a task force that was set up, I think, in 2020 to analyze this and to see the best way forward. And like many conservationists today, we're waiting to see what the government will do and how they work with the communities to address compensation as one of the main means that we can improve tolerance for wildlife in Kenya, and maybe use it as a model that can be shared across the country. So for my research project, I chose to focus on livestock depredation because East Africa is a stronghold for carnivores, large carnivores. And yes, then their numbers are dwindling. In fact, for some of these populations, we don't know their exact numbers in different regions. So my specific research was focused on evaluating the fine scale correlates of multi-carnivore depredation of livestock. What does this mean? This just means I was looking at the different variables or the different factors that can cause livestock depredation or livestock loss by one species or multiple species. And to define conflicts generally, I've used lion as an example. There's many different dimensions that we need to consider when you're looking into conflict with wildlife species, and in this case with carnivores. You have to think about the kind of carnivores that are in the landscape, in the ecosystem, and is it one species that's a challenge, or is it multiple species? We have to think about the livestock dimension, because different carnivores attack different prey, different pastoralists, different carnivores attack different types of livestock. And similarly, depending on where you go, some pastoralists might have a preference for one livestock type over another. We also consider the presence or absence of wild prey in the area. Similarly, the human dimension, and this is where we'll talk about increasing, or we consider rather increasing populations. We're talking about land use changes from previously wild spaces to mixed use spaces such as cultivation or urbanization. We can talk about fencing and fragmentation and the impact of urbanization, like the presence of roads, towns, and things like electricity lines when it comes to conflict. Lastly, we also have to think about environmental dimension, and in this case, specifically climate change. So like I mentioned, there's several carnivores that the conflict in East Africa is rife, and there are several carnivores that have been cited as the most responsible for conflict. And these are the lion, the spotted hyena, the leopard, black-backed jackal, the cheetah, and the wild dog. However, the lion tends to get the brunt of most retaliatory killings, meaning in situations where a carnivore has attacked a homestead and killed some livestock, most likely the species that may suffer in such a situation would be the lion. They'll be they're the species that are most prone to retaliation by spearing, mainly because of, the biology. They rest for 20 hours a day, so they're easier to find, they're easier to spot around the ecosystem. So even if they might not have been the carnivore that led to the livestock loss at the boma or in the village, most chances are, if a lion is spotted, it might be speared. Additionally, we have retaliation by use of poisoning, and poisoning is an indiscriminate killer. It will basically wipe out any individuals of any species that tend to eat on the poisoned carcass of the cow or the goat. And this also includes avian predators. So around there was a time when there was a spike in poisoning cases in Kenya. And this is another reason, or that led me to focus on carnivores when it comes to conflict, because there was so many issues. There was spearing, there was poisoning, the populations are dwindling because of fragmentation and all these other issues such as loss or reduced numbers of wild prey. And I thought it was an amazing, it's basically an amazing arena that has a lot of possibilities. So like I mentioned, East Africa, I chose East Africa as my study area. I'm Kenyan. However, conflict cases occur all across the East African nations, and conflict tends to occur where wildlife and people shared spaces and compete over resources like grazing land and water. So in areas where you have conflict with carnivores, you'll find mainly pastoralist communities that share the same space. And I'm sorry I had to put up a gruesome picture, but this is what we tend to see on the ground if conflict is not addressed. Retaliatory killings of carnivores can lead to severe losses of the populations, and you can even wipe out a local population in an area. So, and this specifically was happening more so in northern Tanzania, and that's where I focused my study on the Maasai Steppe, which is around the Tarangire and Lake Manyara ecosystem. So this is the Tarangire National Park. There's a series of protected areas. This is a national park. We have the Manyara Ranch, which is a privately owned protected area. We have the Manyara National Park and the Lake Manyara here. To the northwest is the Ngorongoro crater, and west of this is Serengeti. So in between this area, we have historical migratory corridors where wildlife move between these protected areas. And this usually happens seasonally. During the dry season, wild prey tends to take refuge in the national parks and the protected areas, mainly because there are more regular sources of water. And when it's the wet season, wild prey tend to spread out of the national parks because during the rainy season, there's more water and fresh grass that's available in the community lands. So during the wet season, you will tend to find carnivores leaving the national parks and following the wild prey into the community areas. Additionally, there are populations of carnivores that reside in the community areas too. While I talked of different dimensions of conflict, I would also like to bring to your attention that conflict occurs at different scales, and this kind of basically directs your research questions and what you're going to look at. For the purpose of my research, I focused to choose two major scales: a fine scale and a large scale, which I term here as ecosystem level. And the ecosystem level is where you want to consider the carrying capacity of a national park or community area. What's the maximum wildlife that place can carry, or are the livestock going beyond what the area can provide? We also consider the impacts of climate change on conflicts when you talk about climate variability. At the ecosystem level, you're kind of addressing land ownership questions and how land use might have changed, including things like grazing rights and switching from previously protected areas or community managed lands to subdivided plots that have been shared across the communities. That can affect the presence of wildlife and the rates of conflict. Additionally, national policies and the impact of conflicts fall under the ecosystem level. For my study specifically, I chose to focus on depredation or carnivore conflict at the household level. And my main question was mainly, what are the factors that lead one boma to experience more livestock loss when compared to the next boma in the same village? Additionally, to unpack it further, why do some villages seem to experience more attack compared to others? And those are kind of questions that cropped up. So for example, I considered the presence of wildlife near the human settlements. And for this, we looked at the presence of multiple carnivores, and you can also look at the presence of wild prey. At the household level, we also looked at the structure of the livestock enclosure, which is known as a boma. So when it comes to the boma, what kind of livestock are being kept in it? How large is the size of the herd? What kind of fencing are we using around the bomas or are being used around the bomas in the Maasai steppe? How many fences too? Because when you go out there, you find that some bomas have single fences and some have double fences. When the height of the fence can also matter depending on the species that we're talking about, the carnivore species we're talking about. We also need to consider the density or how well packed that fence is to prevent access or visibility of the livestock, the presence or absence of a sturdy gate, and if there were any deterrents within that boma. So most of my data points came up from these variables. Additionally, you can also look at resource availability near settlements, availability of pasture, water, because these are things that can tend to attract wild prey close to the bomas. Similarly, you can't ignore urbanization and the different topics around that, for example, proximity to towns or market center, or how close that boma is, for example, to major roads in the area. So all these are things that you can consider, and any one of these can be specific research points that someone can decide to focus on for their study or to see how they can impact conflict or promote coexistence at any of these nodes. So I wanted to understand what variables explain the variation in livestock depredation across the different households. For example, like I mentioned, there's several characteristics of the boma that we have to consider: height, size, livestock size, the type of the boma, the local perceptions about frequency at the boma. I also looked at carnivore presence in the community land and also landscape attributes. How close was the boma to certain roads? How close was it to known water points? Like I mentioned, the focus of my study was based at the boma scale or at the local boma. For those who might not be privy to a boma, it is a traditional pastoralist livestock enclosure that has some semi-permanent structures that are normally homes. These usually have 2 fences or a single fenced bomas. So this, for example, is the outer fence, traditionally made of thorn brush. And the inner enclosure here, which is the second fence, is where they keep the livestock. As you can see, there's the big enclosure here hosts cattle. The smaller one could host the cows. And this side boma characteristically would host the goats. Inside the traditional Maasai boma, they'll separate the livestock and keep them enclosed. Similarly, you'll find a series of homesteads around, and this is what we defined as a boma. At this point, I'd also like to mention that we examined or we surveyed 110 households across 9 different villages in the Maasai steppe, where we looked at the total number of livestock loss in a series of 3 years. This was also based on historical data from our partners who are the Tarangire Lion Project. They are a long-term conservation organization based in the Maasai steppe and have been part of the community and have collected this long-term data set that we're able to use. So we also took data on the reported number of carnivores that are responsible for the livestock loss over the 3 years. This thornbush boma was, it's a traditional way of creating an enclosure, and based on the former pastoralist lifestyles, they would move from place to place. So having thorn brush that could easily be dismantled was preferable because they would move from one location to another. But now we are seeing pastoralist communities becoming more sedentary, mainly because they want access to social services like schools and water, medical facilities. So more and more, we have these bomas becoming semi-permanent or permanent features in the landscape. However, the mechanism of excluding carnivores, which was meant for a temporary lifestyle, is still being used. And that I see as one of the main challenges, because factoring climate change, desertification, and land degradation, we are seeing fewer and fewer thorn bushes that are available to create this type of fences. So ideally, one of my interventions would be to kind of encourage the switch to a more fortified boma. Like I mentioned, we looked at the quality of the boma, the height, the fence. We wanted to know how the carnivores are accessing the different areas and which livestock was killed. In terms of my key findings, we defined the boma types mainly in 2 main categories, where we had the unfortified bomas being thorn bush fences composed mainly of thorn brush or wooden posts. And we classified fortified bomas as those being reinforced with chain link fences, wooden posts or metal posts, including those with live greenery that sprout right from the ground. You'd find that these type of fences are more secure, however, and have been termed as predator-proof. However, I have concerns about the term predator-proof because it means that we're able to completely exclude the carnivores, and as of yet, it's not possible to exclude all carnivores all the time. The idea is to be able to reduce the number of depredations to a tolerable level, and that's how we promote coexistence. So the term predator-proof is not necessarily the best term, because there are cases where you might find carnivore might pass through, especially in cases where you find that the fences have not been well maintained. So when we went to the field, we asked, how often do you think the following species visit your boma? So between the hyena, jackal, lion, and leopard, over 90% of our respondents said that hyena visit very often. And that is incredible when you compare that to the responses of lions, where lions visited the bomas least. They visited least, and meaning they didn't visit very often. And from time to time, they visited some bomas, and this is where you see the impact of seasonality coming in when it comes to the lions. Similarly, with leopards, most respondents said they leopards didn't come oftenly, and many said that a leopard has not approached their boma up until the time we did our survey. Here we can attribute this kind of impacts to the habitat characteristics, and we can infer that most of the bomas in which we did collected our data were not in preferred leopard territory. So this is kind of where I was bringing in that multi-species look or lens, so we can be able to target our mitigation solutions to the problem animals or to the problems that the specific community is facing. So some that may be in more forested areas will experience depredation caused by leopards, and we can tailor our bomas or our enclosures to prevent attacks by leopards. And yes, similarly, the jackal, though in literature we have very few reports of jackals attacking livestock. In this area, we came to know that the jackal was actually the second biggest contributor of livestock loss to the communities. So when we looked at how much livestock was lost in the community across our 9 villages, as you can see, the blue here are the cattle, the orange are shoats, which is a collective term for sheep and goats. In gray are losses to donkeys in the communities, and in yellow are losses to the juvenile goats, the smaller, younger goats, basically. So this tells us that mostly shoats, sheep, goats, and even those at the juvenile stages are more prone to attacking the community. And this can also, you can kind of relate it to the species that are responsible, because when you look at the predation styles, hyenas tend to go for majority goats, and they're responsible for over 50% of the depredation, 52% approximately, followed by jackals, who target specifically the juvenile goats. Lions came in third, and they mainly go for the cattle. So as you can see here, cattle depredations, though it is a significant amount, because this chart shows the total livestock loss, up to 600 for the first village, and about 100 depredation events for the last village. So out of all of them, you can tell that goats were mostly targeted and hyenas were most responsible. This is a similar chart that describes the top species responsible for livestock depredation, where we have the percentage depredation on this axis and the number of villages. So from here, we can see that hyena caused a majority of the depredations, followed by the jackal in the blue. In fact, in Cellular, all depredations were attributed to specifically hyena and jackal between 2015 and 2017. And some villages experienced all four. For example, the one with the most depredation events had reported loss to up to 4 species. This chart shows the influence of total carnivore species on the loss. And basically it tells us that bomas that reported up to 3 carnivore species experienced greater loss compared to those that reported depredation or livestock loss to 1 species. Lastly, I also thought it was important to talk about the local perceptions and why our respondents believed that some bomas experience more loss than others. And mainly, 80% of them said a low quality boma fence is the primary reason some bomas are attacked more than others. This is followed closely by the habit of carnivores to stalk livestock back to bomas. And for example, this is an example of different variables that we don't consider until we go out into the field. When you're out with the pastoralists, they'll tell you that because they take certain routes every day back to their bomas, the predators tend to get used to or familiarize themselves with these habits and learn to stalk the livestock back closer to the bomas. The impact of seasonality is also a major reason. And like I mentioned, during the wet season, or wildlife moves out into the community lands, and the carnivores will follow them. And for this reason, they believe that during the wet season, they get more attacks than others. Some suggest that bomas closer to protected areas receive more attacks than others. Livestock left out at night was a major reason. Over 50% of them suggested that there are instances where livestock is left out, and this kind of, to me, suggests that it's an opportunity to educate and provide different services, livestock husbandry services, to ensure that livestock is not left out of the boma. For example, if we're able to eliminate that, probably we'll see a difference in the number of a reduction in the loss experienced per boma. Slaughter of animals, of livestock near the boma attracts scavengers. Again, for example, what if we moved the area we slaughtered our livestock to further? Would that make a difference in the number of livestock? But our communities have lived and survived with wildlife all along, and I don't think they know. It's basically a known thing that whenever we slaughter our cattle, the hyenas come. So if in that situation, the gate is sturdy, the boma wall is thick, strong, and tall, and there's no livestock left at night, the chances of depredation might be reduced. Additionally, wild prey seek safety near boma. Some members suggested, some respondents suggested that at night, the wild prey tend to move closer to the bomas for security. Mainly because they feel that they're more secure around the people, and for that reason, the carnivores come closer. And lastly, other reasons included scarcity of prey and water sources near the boma. So what are the main interventions that I propose, having seen all this, been out into the field? I basically suggest that mitigation or major mitigation strategies should address the structural integrity of the boma. Our boma fences, high quality fences that prevent entry of carnivores into the enclosures. And also we can kind of adjust the characteristics of the environment to reduce the carnivore attacks. For example, we suggest that the bomas, having a double-walled boma is good because bomas with 2 fences had less livestock loss than bomas with 1 fence. However, the height of the boma matters, especially in areas where you face more leopard depredation or depredation caused by leopards. We propose that fences of over 1.5 meters would be ideal in such situations. Actually, over 50% of the bomas we saw had a height less than 1.5 meters, or actually less than 1 meter. So most of them are quite short and would allow easy entry for the carnivores. So making those boma walls higher, and in some cases where you face depredation by hyenas and jackals that tend to dig under the boma, we could also dig our fences at least a foot deep, so we can have a layer of security that prevents those species that dig through underneath the boma wall. Additionally, we always encourage these additional deterrents such as lion lights in the area. And like I mentioned, we're facing severe degradation of land in these areas as we eliminate all our flora from the communities. There might be nothing left to secure the bomas with the thorn bush. So we suggest fortified boma walls that use a mix of chain link fences and actual trees, live walls that sprout into the chain link fence to make it more sturdier. And we encourage all solutions that promote sustainable mitigations, because ideally, if our communities are becoming more sedentary, we should find ways to switch from the reliance on thorn bush so we can save or reduce the dependence on our trees, and seek out alternative sustainable solutions that could actually mitigate or prevent livestock loss. And the whole goal of this series is to find ways that we can change conflict to coexistence. The previous models of conservation were based on exclusion, and we've seen up to date that it did not work. It put people versus nature, and the model of coexistence is one that promotes solutions for both people and nature. So we all know these suggestions I'm talking about, but specifically to carnivore conservation, incentives that encourage the purchase and the effective maintenance of mitigation solutions are great. For example, I suggest that we propose that we could have schemes that come in and subsidize the materials that are used to create these fortified bomas. For example, if a company was able to subsidize 50%, up to 50% of chain link to certain communities to help them install and manage the fences, would have more community members being more willing, because they've highlighted the cost of these solutions as some of the main barriers to uptake. For example, another example is where we can subsidize solar power, so the use of solar equipment to make the lion lights that are also useful in keeping carnivores away. That would be an ideal example of incentives that we can use to promote coexistence. Conservation benefits such as access, encouraging opportunities for bursaries, access into the protected areas so we can actually see and enjoy what we are protecting. Other benefits that I propose is, for example, access to, community education that includes like livestock husbandry. I talked about how we can come in and help work with the communities to better manage the livestock, such that even in the case that they face challenges such as drought or livestock loss to depredation, they are able to have saved certain benefits that can help them sustain when the things are, when things get thick. Another example is community development, where I suggest looking at our communities or looking at mitigations that provide all-rounded solutions to communities. And in this case, we talk about cross-disciplinary collaborations, where I, as a researcher, shouldn't go into a community alone. I should go with Maureen, who is a social scientist, who can also pick up on the different social challenges that the community is facing. in my team addressing mitigation solutions with pastoralists, I would also love to have a veterinary or a veterinary scientist or someone in that field who can come in and help deal with some of the challenges that the community is facing with livestock issues. Can we bring in, an engineer who can talk about access to water and electricity for them? Can we bring in, different support systems such as like medical camps and things like that, such that we are able to encourage well-rounded development from the community, and they're able to attribute these benefits and the evidence of development to conservation. So that's my message for today. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. I would like to thank Bernard Kisui of the School for Field Studies, where we did our project, my supervisor, Robert Montgomery, and colleagues in the Recap Lab, including Rose Kahilia and Steve Gray, who helped me collect my data and analyze it. I received support from Idea Wild, who are an amazing support for young conservationists in the field, MSU International, as well as the MasterCard Foundation program. I don't have my references here, but I'm happy to provide this. You can get more details on my paper or the paper we published online with the African Journal of Ecology. I can share you the link to our paper, and I'll also leave my contact information in the chat box. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
You're welcome to ask questions, comment. Now you can also ask questions in the chat, and both Susan and Maureen are available. Maureen will unfortunately soon have to leave, so if you have questions for Maureen, the time to ask them is now straight away, please. From my side, perhaps Maureen and Susan both, if I can open the questions with a question of, if you are both situated in Kenya, in terms of human wildlife conflict, if people would be interested, and I'm also just touching on a comment that came in earlier, where would the need be the greatest for, if somebody's looking at a master's degree or a PhD at the moment, and they're looking at human wildlife conflict, what would be possible topics? Because I'm sensing that we have some postgraduate students in the audience today. So it would be interesting to hear from you and possible study areas where people can look at.
I can go fast and say that I'm always interested to find out what can make the approaches most. The people are being taught about this for so many years, but then they don't stick to what they're being taught. And I would like this is a social science perspective, like what makes people decide to take one approach and not the other, and what can we do, like what makes people prefer one approach over the other, and what can we do to make people like take the conservation approaches much longer. Yeah, that's one of the things I've seen.
To make it more sustainable in the long term. I think this is the question about conservation in general at the moment. If you just look at the whole climate change question, because everybody knows and has, the knowledge of what climate change is doing to us has been out there for some time now, and yet the trend is not going in the direction that we want to see in terms of carbon emissions, which means we are keeping, we're not changing as we should change. Susan, from your side, would you like to add?
I would say the best way at it is to always start with an open mind. Don't go at it by focusing on the specifics. You don't imagine you already know what issue you want to talk about or research and focus on.
Oh my goodness, it seems like we are losing Susan as well. We're just going to check and see if we can get her back. I know that they are experiencing some issues in Kenya at the moment with electricity stability, as we often do in South Africa as well. So it seems to be a bit of an issue at the moment. Okay, I have a question in the chat at the moment from Joel. How do you go about a problematic animal attack to human being like elephant in Amboseli, like the one happened just recently in Masimba in Amboseli? Maureen, I'm going to ask you to take that one.
I think it's a very difficult question because it's like I'm not very sure about the details in Masimba, but when you're looking at conflict, the approach that I always lean on is this they call it conflict transformation. So what I've said in the talk, it's like the event of what happened. I believe whatever happened in Masimba is not just the actual, it's not the if it was it someone was killed by an elephant? I'm not very sure about that. But then when you're looking at the conflict, the visible expression of the conflict, if like a human being has been killed by an elephant, or an elephant has injured a human being, a human being has killed an elephant, it's usually not, that is not the main problem. And when you're looking at conflict transformation, it's good to get both stakeholders, like the community members and also the people in conservation, to find out what has led to this interaction to happen and find out solutions, because the event is not the conflict. The conflict has been coming, like it has always been in waiting. So you just try to go through the transformation model to try and understand what has led to it. And that's something a lot of conservationists are not very equipped to do, because like conflict is also like, there's also the people who have conflict studies and they solve conflicts as a way of living. But then in conservation, I see that we're always resorting to technical things like building fences and stuff, but we also need to start looking at the social things that have happened and contributed to the conflict and this interaction. So I think it's just people coming on the table and just finding out like what has led to this event, even going back through the years. Yeah.
Maureen, do you see and this is my own curiosity, do you see a movement to conservationists including the social issues more and more, or not yet?
I think I can see it as completely, because now people are not talking about conflict, they're talking about coexistence. And coexistence, they say that when they're talking about coexistence, it's acknowledging that conflict is part of our day-to-day. And we need to accept conflict always happens, but then we need to take conflict as an opportunity to learn. And when you start thinking about learning, it's us human beings that are learning. So it becomes a social phenomenon. And you can see a lot of papers now talking about coexistence, and they're talking about understanding the social side of it, because the technical solutions have not been effective until now. So we need to start looking at the social, and it's being embraced. If you look at the papers over the years, there's a lot of people talking about the social aspect of it.
I think it's also good that we have women entering the field of conservation more and more, because the image of men walking around with military gear doesn't help in this regard. So yes, we have some more questions coming in now. Let me just make sure that I'm not missing any. From Fred, with the data collected and from other sources, could this information be mapped to help monitor and predict future movement of the animals? So in other words, are you using the data? Are you perhaps using GIS in any specific way? And you can both talk to that. Maureen, I know you have to leave soon, so if you want to answer first, you're welcome.
At the moment, I'm not using any GIS because my research is mostly qualitative. But what I'm doing is that from my research, I'm trying to develop a framework that the next part of my research is trying to working with the community members to see if we understand the trends of the different changes that have happened in the community and how this affects the relationship between humans and elephant, then we can also predict, like we can forecast if this and this happens, then this is how the community will react to the wildlife. But as Susan was saying, my research completely changed because I had an idea of this is what I wanted. Then I went to the community and they said, no, we don't even want to hear what you're saying. We want you to look at this and this because this is what is affecting us. So I'm open to that. And I think that's what is now guiding me, because they know what has happened in the past years. They know what's happening now, and they can actually tell you if this and this happened, this is what will happen, will do. And so I'm trying to develop a framework that will be used by conservationists as a decision-making tool. So if they see the trends are leading towards this scenario, then they are already prepared to manage the conflict before it happens. So, yeah.
Keeping an open mind is really important.
I would say the use of GIS is highly critical to a lot of work that's done in the field. Through GIS, we're able to conceptualize these challenges on a larger scale. Like when I talked about my work being on a fine scale at the household level, when you plot all those on the map, you're able to see which areas come up as hotspots, which areas have more higher conflicts than others, and this can help guide decision making as to maybe where you will, if you have limited resources, where you'll put more effort and resources like funding into, versus it kind of helps direct your next step. For my work, I didn't use it too much beyond calculating proximity to roads, distances. And that's kind of how I was able I used it basically as the base to come up with basically data for my modeling, and I used R for that. Ultimately, once these data sets are prepared and we have amazing maps and visual representations of conflict, I encourage and advocate for sharing of data across different projects and different fields, because it's easier to learn and pick up from what's happening in different parts of Africa, for example, compare, contrast. So I actually advocate for these data sharing platforms, and I think it's amazing. Kind of towards what Johan was alluding to earlier, scientists tend to keep their data to themselves, and we love our data. Previously or prior to where we are in the industry now, people were not sharing information, but we're seeing a change where people are more willing to share their information, share their learning and their experiences, so we can, because we've all realized we're all in it for the same. And there are some platforms, though I've not seen it for conflicts, I can be corrected if I'm wrong, but different aspects in conservation, such as forest restoration. There are lots of database clouds, softwares and systems that you can actually visualize restoration as it takes place. I would love to see the same for conflict, to see what's happening where, and to be able to kind of like bring that to the scales where we're operating.
Fantastic. Okay, we have some more questions in the chat. Just so everybody knows, Maureen had to leave, unfortunately. She had a prior arrangement and engagement that she had to keep to, so it's not that she fell out. Unfortunately, she had to go at this point. Then another question from Rakib. To what extent do you think human-wildlife conflict could be mitigated by concerted landscape restoration? For instance, if ungulate densities were to be restored to historic densities, do you think livestock depredation would still be prevalent? That's a mouthful.
Basically, conservation as a whole can benefit from restoration or large-scale restoration efforts. And but however, its impact on conflict, now that's an opportunity for research, you know. It's where we can each plug in and see what we can contribute. Basically, we have to look at the current capacity of these areas in terms of how much wild prey, wildlife can the area contain. Similarly, livestock, we're seeing more and more livestock actually replacing the ungulate populations in these areas. So it's this is definitely an opportunity where we can work with communities to see if there's a amenable, viable population. You know, if you have an excess of something number of herds, like it's more detrimental. I'm just suggesting, I don't know, because I've not done the research, but I would really love to see how we can work with communities to create a balance for livestock space and to ensure that their pastoral rights are maintained, and similarly that there's space and suitable habitat to encourage wildlife and wild prey for the carnivores.
I would like to refer you to the work of the Grevi Zebra Trust in the north of Kenya, where they are actively involved in community education programs, but focusing on restoration of grasslands. Because the Grevi zebras, they graze in the same areas as the livestock, and same problems with drought, climate change, etc. Both the livestock and the Grevi zebras are under severe pressure because of the degradation of the landscape, and they're doing excellent work there in restoring the landscapes through education projects. Then another question from Fred. From your research suggestions, what is the Kenyan government and the responsible ministries or departments doing to help protect and mitigate the depredation?
I would say it's down to creating enabling policies or policies that limit conservation. At the national scale, we have, for example, like I mentioned, the compensation scheme, but how effective is it? Has it been translated to the ground? Are people seeing the benefits of compensation in this case, where that's how they would prefer to get the benefits, you know, from conservation? They want to be compensated for any loss that they accrue. However, if the systems are not enabling to allow that to happen, in law, it can be there in paper. For example, these compensation committees were in paper for a very long time, from 2013. But over the years, we have seen more and more development into actually actioning the committees and getting the information out. So, like I mentioned, when it comes to conflicts, I know that there's a task force that was set up and they came up with a report. You can look it up, the task force, like 2020 report on human wildlife conflict in Kenya. And they propose the different, they propose a way in which communities can receive benefits through compensation. So having that translate to the ground, encouraging outreach sessions, county-sponsored sessions where we talk with the communities, having community representatives visit these households that experience these kind of problems and see them on the eye-to-eye and a personal level also helps, you know. Sometimes these people also just want to vent. And having, let's say, a representative of the government give them audience in a stakeholder engagement session where they can express their concern with how things are managed, kind of leads to a positive relationship between the national bodies, our conservationists, and the stakeholders. So at the end of the day, we have a role to play. But public, private, and the people all have, if they're all engaged equally, we'll be able to see, we'll be able to promote conservation. Conflict being one of the challenges that are leading to wildlife loss.
Yeah, I also remember from yesterday's session that Kate also mentioned in Botswana, they also have a compensation scheme, but very, very few people are actually claiming because they simply don't trust it to actually work. So that's something that governments need to work on if they expect people to participate in those systems. A comment and perhaps a question in the comment from Kate. I have found both talks fascinating. Thank you. This is to follow on from one of the first comments regarding helping people to stay engaged with conservational issues, such as climate change, for example, which, as you say, we have known about for a long time, but perhaps does not motivate sustained and sustainable action. As a mother and community member, I am interested in how I can help my child to start to be invested in these issues early in order to support future change. This is not limited to climate change, of course. So that's an interesting question. How do you start early? How do you, and it's of course the right stage to start.
Yes, thank you for that question. Like your question alludes to, reaching out to the children is a very important step when it comes to raising a community of our generation of concerned and concerned individuals who love the wildlife and would love to protect the environment. So I would say exposure from an early on, get them exposed to learning about different aspects of the environment. When they go into the forest and they have an interest in the butterflies, take the time to explain why the butterfly is important, from your own basic understanding. And from there is when you'll be able to develop the interests. You can start with something small like insects. Next thing, you're planting something in your backyard, your kitchen garden. Next, you're going to plant some seed balls or, contribute to a restoration effort. And that child, having been exposed at different stages of their life, will grow up more aware and more willing to conserve wildlife and the environment. As many organizations in Africa do now, for example, at Colobus Conservation, we have a school education workshop program where we want to encourage and instill the love for wildlife, specifically primates. So there's an opportunity for interested people to come together and provide this sort of education as a service to the community. Can organize field trips to the parks, organize hikes to the different waterfalls, and this kind of opportunities would allow one to develop the passion. I hope that has answered your question well.
Thanks for that, Susan. I must say, when I visited Kenya, I was quite impressed with the number of organizations engaged in education, wildlife education and conservation education. That was quite Kenya Wildlife Club's also a very organized and effective system that they have in place there. We also visited the Giraffe Center in Nairobi, another fascinating place. So thank you to everybody for attending. If there are no further questions, I know we've taken up a lot of Susan's time. So if there are no further questions, I'm going to thank Maureen in her absence for a wonderful talk. And Susan, thank you so much. And thank you for fielding the questions and giving us very complete answers. And we're hoping that we will welcome you back to our platform as well as the Unlocking Nature platform in the near future again. And if you would like to support Susan's cause, it's the Colobus Conservation. We've posted the link in the chat. You're welcome to find out more there and get in touch with her. Susan, if you'd like, I'm not sure if you already posted your email address, if somebody would like to contact you.
Yes, I shared my email. I'll share it again just now. But I'd just like to say thank you again to Unlocking Nature, Share Skin Africa for this amazing opportunity to share my work with an audience of interested listeners. I hope it's been engaging. And I look forward to getting the opportunity again. Thank you so much.